okay. Okay, let us pray. Loving God, in the name of your Son, Jesus, we come into your presence at this time of study and worship. And so we come joyfully and gratefully, reverently and expectantly, as we long to deepen our knowledge of you, O God, and of your word. Open our hearts now to your presence with us. Open our minds to new thoughts and fresh information. At this time, we worship you with our minds and with our lips. Let us seek in the days that lie ahead to worship you, especially with our lives. Father, we've been mentioning a number of people who need your special help, your blessing, your healing, and we just commend them to you and ask for your wonderful powers to touch their lives, change their situations. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, we're turning back to Acts chapter 9, and we finished off where we discovered that between verse 19 of this chapter and verse 20 of this chapter, there was a 3-year gap. And during that 3-year gap, Saul went off to Arabia to be prepared, to be trained, and so on. And as I mentioned, the only reason we know about this 3-year gap is because Paul tells the church in Galatia, in his letter to them, this is what happened. Now, we looked at whether or not Luke, when he wrote this, either did he not know about Paul's 3-year period in Arabia, or did he not think it relevant or important or essential to mention it and didn't want to interrupt the flow of the narrative in Acts of the Apostles. But nonetheless, it's kind of good that you know that there is this 3-year gap between verses 19 and 20. And in 20, he comes back. Paul comes back to Galatia, continues his ministry there, and is under threat. The Jews are intending to kill him. He's such a powerful advocate for Jesus. He's reaching people, he's persuading people, he's talking to people, and people are rethinking their thoughts and their understanding of this Jesus of Nazareth. Now, it would be impossible to overestimate the value of the Apostle Paul and all that he did in the early church. If you think about just the one or two facts. In AD 35, the Christians were viewed as a small sect of Judaism. But in 30 years, they had become a world religion. They had planted churches in many, many cities in the empire, the Roman Empire. And they were influencing hundreds of people by the teaching and so on. And realized that in 300 years, which in historical terms is the blink of an eye, in 300 years, they had swept the Greek and Roman gods from the high streets of the Mediterranean world. Think of that. 300 years they had become the dominant force, the number one faith, the number one religion in the ancient world in 300 years. But as I say, if you take AD 35, they're a small handful, they're a sect of the Jews. And nobody's paying any attention to them. Nobody thinks they're in any way important or significant. There's no great movement. But in 30 years, they're impacting everywhere from the Roman palace, the royal palace in Rome, downward. In different cities, in different locations, and so on. Heather and I got to visit places in Greece where Paul had gone. The city of Berea has a different name now. The city of Corinth big cities, important cities within the Roman Empire where Paul had been, where a church was founded, where churches flourished and grew and so on. So it would be impossible to overestimate the importance. Plus the fact, if you think about it, Paul has written almost half of the New Testament. The letters, the epistles, and so on of Paul. Now, I want us to pick it up. Now, they send Paul off. They take him up to the port of Caesarea up on the coast, and they send him off to Tarshish. In other words, they send him home. Verse 31 is significant. Then the church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace. It was strengthened and encouraged by the Holy Spirit and grew in numbers, living in the fear of the Lord. Now, this was a period of growth as well as a period of peace. Paul the persecutor was gone. Saul the persecutor had turned into Paul the preacher. And the high priest and so on, they just didn't bother with the new Christians. They just ignored them. They perhaps thought, well, they will simply go away. They'll fizzle out. The whole movement will just dissolve and so on. And so you have this period, and in this section, the scene shifts from Paul to Peter. Let's pick it up at verse 32. As Peter traveled about the country, he went to visit the saints in Lydia, and there he found a man called Ananias, a paralytic who had been bedridden for 8 years. Ananias, Peter said to him, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up, take care of your mat. And immediately he got up. All those who lived in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. So here is Paul on a journey. He's up the coastal region. If you were to look at a map of Palestine, you would see the coastal area, Joppa. You would see Caesarea and so on the coast, the headquarters of the Roman world. If you go to what in the Bible is called Lydda today, you'll find it's the site for the airport for Tel Aviv. So you might end up landing there, and you'll say, well, I hope I'm not too late to miss the Apostle Peter. But that's where it was. So he goes up the coastal plain and begins to visit. Now again, remember, let's nail this down. They're only speaking to Jews. These new Christians, they're all almost exclusively Jewish converts to Christianity. And they're only sharing the message of Jesus with other Jews. And you'll see how then in this section that is broken and that changes. So he heals this man. Verse 36, in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which is translated as Dorcas. Some churches have a Dorcas ministry. Have you ever been in one that had a Dorcas ministry? No. Very popular in some churches. She was always doing good. She was always helping the poor. And about that time, she became sick and died. And her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. And Lydda was near Joppa. And when the disciples heard that Peter was there, they sent two men to him and urged him, come, please come at once. Peter went with them. Now, obviously, the woman's already dead. So they have to really, really believe in the amazing power of Peter and the other apostles. It makes no sense. They're not coming to ask him to conduct the memorial service. They're not asking him to come and sympathize with the family. There's a sense in which they feel, well, maybe even as late as things are, maybe Peter can do something. And verse 39, Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him, stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and the other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. She was obviously a great seamstress. She was a great sewer. She was a great designer of clothing, and some of the women would have garments that they had had Dorcas make for them. And it's the most natural thing in the world. It's saying, look at this dress that she made and so on. It's very human, very ordinary. If you were writing an account of this, you wouldn't really put that in. You would say, well, that's not important. But it's important to them because they loved it. Randy?
What exactly is a Dorcas ministry?
Well, the sort of clue is in the title where it says that she helped the poor. And Dorcas ministry goes out and helps people who are in poor state and visits people and takes food to people. That's what a Dorcas ministry. It's doing social work within the community and so on. So they were very proud of this woman, obviously very fond of her, thought the world of her, and they're showing off the things that she had made with great skill. Verse 40, Peter sent them all out of the room, and then they got down on his knees and prayed. Turning towards the dead woman, he said, Tabitha, get up. And she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. And he took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called the believers and the widows and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. Now, he first heals this man who has been paralyzed for 8 years, and that makes his fame well known in the area. His testimony is powerful. And then he brings this woman Dorcas or Tabitha back from the dead. You notice that he's following the pattern of what Jesus did with, for instance, Jairus' daughter, where he put everyone out of the house, and Jesus went into the room of the little girl, closed the door, just took her mother and father and 3 disciples, and they went into the room, and Jesus brought Jairus' daughter back to life. And here is Peter instantly healing these people. There's no recovery period. There's no period of rehab. It's instantaneous and immediate. And so Peter's preaching and teaching in this area is tremendously powerful. And what he was able to do has spread throughout the region. Having cured and healed a paralyzed man, he brings back to life a woman who is dead. And Peter stays on to ground the new believers in the truth, to tell them more and more about Jesus, his ministry, his miracles, his messages. He's really working with these new believers in this area so that they're really grounded in what they need to do as they begin to follow. Traveling evangelists are a phenomenon from about the 1850s, I suppose. And the joke used to be that a traveling evangelist visiting your church was a man in the pulpit with his car in your parking lot with the engine running. In other words, he was here today and gone tomorrow. And he hit town, and you had a campaign, and maybe you had a tent, and you draw people from all the community, and people decide that they will make a commitment, they will follow Jesus Christ, they respond to the message, and then the evangelist is gone. And one of many great things that the Billy Graham organization did before they did a campaign anywhere was that they set up follow-ups. They talked to local people, local clergy. Billy Graham had advanced people when they were doing Mission England a number of years ago. They sent people ahead and said, now we're going to do meetings in these various towns, the big cities like Birmingham and Manchester and Glasgow and so on. And they sort of put together, well, we're going to need ministers, we're going to need Christians who can get with these new converts and really help them. Really get them bedded into the faith, get them to understand what being a Christian is all about. So Peter is spending some weeks, some months, as a follow-up, teaching and preaching and telling about what Jesus did. And as I've said before, in the ancient world, chronology was not a big thing. And the timelines jump about. We'll see that as we come on, because Luke gives us something in one verse which should have gone in way earlier, and so on. But we'll see that. But what I'm getting at is that in the ancient world, amongst historians and writers and people, they were not so focused on, well, this happened in this year and then the following year, and so they didn't do that. They tended to write thematically. They tended to write on a particular subject or topic or whatever. For instance, I've said to you before, if you look at Matthew's gospel, Matthew writes thematically. Matthew, if you read Matthew's gospel, he puts 5 or 6 parables together, or 5 or 6 healings where Jesus heals a blind man, and then he heals a leper, and then he does this and heals this person, that person. Now, Matthew never means to suggest that all of those things happened at roughly the same time in roughly the same place. He's only writing saying, well, here's an example of one healing, here's another, here's another, here's another. He's just showing the breadth of the healing powers and ability of Jesus. So he's not writing chronologically, he's writing thematically. And in the ancient world, in the Greeks and Romans, they were not really focused on getting things in the right order at the right time. So don't be surprised if things sort of jump about and you get an account of something which really happened before the thing you were just told about, and so on. We'll see it in the next chapter. Now, Acts chapter 10 is a watershed event in the history of the early church. Now, you will remember when Peter makes that great confession, Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And firstly, they say what the general view is about Jesus. They say what the people in the marketplace and the streets say about you. And then Jesus brings it home and he says, well, who do you say that I am? And then Peter makes that wonderful confession, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus follows it up by saying, you are Peter, and upon this rock. Now, we haven't time to look at that, but we've looked at it before. It's a play on words on Peter's name. But upon this statement is what it means. It doesn't mean upon Peter. Upon the confession that you're making, Peter, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Upon that recognition and confession of my deity, I will build my church. And he talks about giving Peter the keys. You will have the keys, and you will unlock what no one else can unlock, and you will lock what no one else can lock, and so on. Now, think about it in this terms. If you have a key ring, I'm pretty certain you have more than one key on your key ring. Is that right? You'd be very unusual if you only had one key. But thinking of that idea of the keys, the first key that Peter and the other apostles are using is the key to open the door to Jesus for their fellow countrymen, for the Jews. You're about to see the second key used. Now remember, the first key on the day of Pentecost is a mission to those who are Jewish. An opening of the gospel, a recognition of who Jesus is. Peter's about to use the second key to open the door, and I have to say to you, he doesn't open it very wide. He just kind of opens it a crack, as we say, to Gentiles. And he's very uncertain about this. He's not sure if he's doing the right thing and so on. He has to be persuaded, and he has to be told by God 3 times. We'll see it as we come to it. But here is Peter using the second key on the spiritual key ring to open this. Now, he meets this Roman centurion. Pick it up at verse 1 of chapter 10. At Caesarea, there was a man called Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. The reason that's put in, that Italian regiment business, is that by this stage in the Roman army, they would recruit men to join the army from a whole variety of nations. When they conquered a country, they would offer those men a chance to join and fight in the legions of Rome. They invaded Gaul, modern-day France, and there were Frenchmen who joined in the army. They did it in Britain, Britannica, and there were British people who joined. Why? Because you got food on a regular basis, you got paid, there were benefits and all the rest of it. In an age when otherwise you might be scrabbling around, not having enough to eat. But you got regular food, regular pay, and all the rest of it. And so you were trained and went into some of the Roman legions. The only people they didn't recruit were Jews. Not that Jews can't fight. History has proven that wrong. Why did they not recruit Jews? Can anybody guess? It's not really an obvious answer. But here's why. Because if the general scheduled the war or the battle on the Sabbath day, the Jewish regiments wouldn't fight. They wouldn't break the Sabbath. You know, you can imagine someone who's leading a Jewish group, a Jewish legion, and say, well, you know, that's not a very good day for us. Could we look at Monday? Or, you know, that kind of thing is not going to work with the Roman army. So they recruited these other people from other nations, and they put them into their regiments, and they gave them Roman officers and so on. What it's saying is this guy is a true Roman. He's from Italy. He's part of the Italian regiment. So they were considered sort of elevated. They were more significant, more important, and better thought of, and so on. Now, he and his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need, and he prayed to God regularly. Now, he wasn't a Jew. He hadn't taken that step of becoming a Jew, but he was on the fringes. He's living in Jewish territory. He's exploring the Jewish faith, the Hebrew faith. And he's impressed, and he admires them, and his admiration goes as far as his pocketbook. He helps people. And we meet a centurion, for instance, who had a servant who was ill in the Gospels. And the local Jewish people come and ask Jesus to help him because he's generous to the local synagogue. He gives us money. He helps us in all kinds of ways. This is a similar situation. He's God-fearing. He's generous. He's kind. He's thoughtful. There's nothing of the harsh, brutal nature of an occupying force with this man. He is kind and gracious. He gave generously to those in need, prayed to God regularly. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. And he distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, Cornelius. Cornelius stared at him in fear. What is it, Lord? The angel answered, your prayers and your gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter, and he is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants, and he told them everything that happened and sent them to Joppa. Now, Cornelius is a man who is on the edge of faith. He's obviously rejected the gods of the Roman and Greek culture. He doesn't believe in them, and he's looking, he's searching, and he's discovered, because he's staying in Palestine, he's discovered this Jehovah God. And he's having a prayer time, and he gets this vision. And God is speaking to him through an angel, and he doesn't hesitate. He acts immediately. He sends his servants. Now, at this stage, if you're interested in the timeline, the Church of Jesus Christ has existed at this point with Cornelius for about 6 or 7 years. Some would say a little bit older, but about that, within 10 years of the death and resurrection of Jesus. 6 or 7 years since this happened. And Caesarea was, I think we touched on this before, Caesarea was a despised city for the Jews because everything about it smacked of Roman rule. It was built by Herod the Great. He's the guy who killed the babies in Bethlehem at the time of Jesus. It was built to honor, to please Augustus Caesar. And everything is built in a Greek and Roman style. There were Roman baths, and there were amphitheaters, and there were stadiums, and there was all kinds of things. And to the Jews, it was an in-your-face reminder that these people are occupying your country. They're controlling your life. You do not have freedom as a Jew. Everything is under the power and might of the Roman Empire. And they hated Caesarea with a passion. They stayed away from it. They viewed it as a polluting influence on their society and so on. And it was the center for the Roman governor. It was where the garrisons of Rome were based. They moved out, of course, to different parts. When at the time of the feasts of the Jews, especially the Passover, the Roman governor would send many more troops to Jerusalem to keep the peace, because it was always a powder keg. And you never know when a revolt or a rebellion or a riot was going to pop up. And so he sends these people on a 30-mile trip from Caesarea, where Cornelius is, to Joppa. So they either came on foot, or they came on horseback, or they came with a chariot, and they arrive at Simon's house. Simon the tanner, the person who Peter is staying with. So it's probably, you see, he has the vision, 3 o'clock the afternoon, and they're at the house the next day. That's the timeline on that. Verse 9. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey approaching the city, Peter went up onto the roof to pray, and he became hungry and wanted something to eat. While the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance, and he saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners. It contained all kinds of 4-footed animals, as well as reptiles of the earth and birds of the air, and a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," he said. "I've never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times. So he sees this sheet coming down with all this variety of animals which are in it, and then the sheet is taken back into heaven. Now, Peter's pondering, what does all this mean? What a crazy dream. I must have had too much cheese last night or something. So he's thinking about this. What does all this mean? Verse 17, while Peter was wondering about the meaning of this, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. Now you notice they don't, here's a small point, but they're very courteous. This is the occupying force. They don't burst their way in. They don't use strong-arm tactics. They're not forceful. They come to the gate because here's what they understand, what they respect. And they've been in Palestine long enough to know that if a Gentile, if a non-Jew entered your home, it was an offense to a Jewish homeowner. You felt that they had invaded, not just, we use the phrase invaded my space. They had not just invaded my space, but they had polluted my home. And you had to go through a sort of cleansing process to get your home back to being what it should be. And they stop. They don't go any further. Where are we? Verse 19, so while Peter was thinking about this, the Spirit said to him, Simon, 3 men are looking for you, so get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them to you. Now, the point I was making is way up in verse 17. They stopped at the gate. They called out. They didn't burst into the home. They didn't even pound on the door. They stayed off Simon the tanner's property out of respect. And so verse 21, Peter went down and said to them, I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come? The men replied, we have come from Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. Now it doesn't say he's one of the Jewish people. He's not. But he's recognized as a man of integrity, and so on. A holy angel told him to have you come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say. Then, here's the open door, then Peter invited the men into the house to be his guests. Now this had to be okay with Simon the tanner, because it's his house after all, but Peter had cleared that. And now, this whole thing about the tent, the sheet coming down with all the animals, Peter, like most Jews, was scrupulous in following the dietary laws of the Jews from birth. There were animals they could eat and animals that they could not eat, things that they had to abstain from. And we're talking more than just pork. And it was hard for Peter to see this. You know, think of people who have been teetotal all their life. And somebody, they go and visit someone and says, oh, can I give you a whiskey? And you go, oh, no, I don't drink. And so on. But there are legalists, by the way, within the Jewish faith and within the Christian faith. Have you noticed how legalists always take pride in the negatives? It's always the thing about what they don't do. You notice that with some people? There used to be a phrase that circulated in Southern Baptist circles. The phrase was, I don't smoke and I don't chew and I don't go with girls who do. Did you ever hear that one? Well, maybe some of you grew up Lutheran, you know, and you were hidden, your sensitive ears were hidden from those things. But that was the phrase, you know, it just meant that I have certain standards and, you know, I don't do that. Now, Peter is really beginning to wonder what all of this means. He's still got this vision in his head. He's thinking about it. He's thinking about the emphasis on it, that this sheet comes down 3 times. And he's beginning to say, maybe God is in this. What is God trying to tell me? You know, don't call anything unclean that God has made clean, and so on. And 3 times, Peter has to be told. And so on. So the Romans arrive, they tell him the purpose of their mission, why they have come, and Peter at this point has to learn that Jesus is breaking down every barrier in the world. Think about that. The Christian church is the first if I can call it an organization, in a way that we understand it, is breaking down every barrier. Social barriers, no difference between rich and poor. Slave owner and slave. Educated and ignorant. Black and white. Everything is broken down. The gospel is flattening all of these fences, all of these barriers. Men and women. No difference. I mean, think in the ancient world, that is a tremendously revolutionary thought. That all the social, political, educational, religious barriers are just swept away. Sorry? And it still is. Yes, in the best of churches, it still is. That you could, you would be somewhere with people who... I grew up in Britain, and class was a much more important thing than it is here. Americans pride themselves on having a classless society. The only class you recognize is the dollar. Because there's a big difference between rich and poor in America. And if you get into trouble, there's a big difference as to whether you get off or end up in jail. And the difference is a dollar sign. Whether you pay for a very affluent and very successful attorney, or whether you have to rely on a public defender, will determine whether or not you go to jail or not. Now, here is the gospel about to sweep across the Greek and Roman world and unite rich and poor, Jew and Gentile, Roman, Greek, Jewish, educated and uneducated, men and women. We have to stop at that point, I think. But if you could read the rest of the section, read from verse 24 of this section to get you have the journey, you have the meeting with Cornelius, and you have everything from there. And Peter becomes more and more convinced that all of this is God. It is an example of, trying to take the country out of the boy, trying to break the lifelong influence of Judaism on Peter's life. That there are certain things which, if you were a Jew, were unthinkable, unimaginable. You would never dream of doing it. And suddenly it seems, in the cause of Jesus, those things which were once so important are being swept away. Has anyone got any questions or comments or anything they want to share? Your father was a minister? Any role? Well, let me just explain this bit to the first bit. Jan's making the point that her father was a minister, and he did something which was very revolutionary in his time and in his era, that he invited a woman into the pulpit and allowed her to preach and teach. And there are women who will never get into certain denominational pulpits. It would be absolutely unheard of. I came from English Congregationalism, and we were one of the few denominations. I'm talking about back in the 30s and the 40s. Not that I'm that old, although I look that old. But if you go back to the 30s and 40s and 50s and so on, that was unheard of. Now, I can remember meeting her. There was a woman minister who was famous in the English Congregational Church. Her name was Elsie Chamberlain. And she was about the first minister that we ever had in British Congregationalism. And we were pilloried and we were criticized by the Presbyterians and the Episcopal Church and the Methodist Church, and everybody threw stones at us for ordaining this woman as a minister. And she was just the first one. She was the first wave of other female ministers who went into congregational ministry. But we suffered because of it. Churches wouldn't unite with you for a Christmas service and different things like that. Go ahead, Jan. So you were Methodists. Well, God can forgive anything. Your cousin? Right? Yeah. Yep. Right. Jan's making the point that evangelists, like we were talking a little bit earlier, the joke about, having the car in the parking lot with the engine running, evangelists were a very big deal. Jan's making the point in the South. They were a very big deal in Ireland. They really were. And they were very big, not so much in England, but Scotland and Wales. You can read a little bit about the Welsh revival, which came out of one of those things and so on. So traveling evangelists were. We had one who had been the minister of the largest congregational church in Northern Ireland, which at that time was Abbott's Cross Congregational Church, and he ministered there for a while, and then he became a traveling evangelist, Sam Workman. He was a great fella. When he had a Sunday off, he would come and visit our church. He liked our people, liked our church. He and his wife were very kind to Heather and I, and he would come. I always felt embarrassed because he was a far, far, far better preacher than I was, and I felt sorry for him sitting listening to me, and I always felt that he should be in the pulpit and I should be sitting listening to him. But Sam was one of the most successful. He was sort of like the Northern Ireland Billy Graham, and he conducted missions all over, and they would have a tent, and he did it for all kinds of churches. He was tremendously blessed and used by God as an evangelist. Sam Workman, you can actually Google and you will see videos of him doing sermons and so on. So thank you for sharing that, Jan. But the whole thing of the women in the pulpit, women in the ministry has been a battleground, and that's my experience, that as a little boy, meeting Elsie Chamberlain, who came to Northern Ireland and so on, and visited. She was English, and she had several good ministries. She was a very, very good preacher, very good teacher. She was a great, great lady, Elsie. Anybody else? Randy?
Just as much as everybody knows, we do in Congregationalism in America, we do have a lot of women.
Oh, we do. Yes, we do. Yeah, we certainly do. But the only point I was making was she was the start of the whole thing in British congregation, and it was not easy to start with that, because you couldn't find a woman in virtually any other denomination in the UK in the 20s and 30s and 40s and so on. It didn't happen till later. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. See you next time.